There are what I call four major myths associated with what I label as unconventional development of natural gas from shale formations using multi-well clustered pads employing high-volume hydraulic fracturing from long laterals. Now, most people just call that fracking. I don't. It is what it is. It's more than fracking. There are four myths associated with this entire process, this unconventional natural gas development process. And those myths relate to the entire life cycle, not just a very brief time when during the entire life cycle of natural gas development from shale, there's fracking going on. That fracking process only occurs over a few hours, and a shale gas well allegedly is supposed to last for many, many years. So these four myths encompass the entire process. So I'll name them, and I'll briefly describe what each one is. And first I have to tell you why I think they're called myths, or why I call them a myth. A myth is something that we hear about that has a kernel of truth. At the heart of a myth is something that is really believable. Otherwise we wouldn't bother listening to the rest of it. But a myth goes beyond truth and it embellishes it so that it becomes a fable, more fictional than truth. So as I describe each of these four myths, I'll tell you what the kernel of truth is, and I'll tell you how it's been embellished to become more fable than fact. So first is that fracking has been used for over 60 years on over a million wells around the world. Therefore, why should we worry about it? It's tried and true standard operating procedure of the industry. Fact. Fracking has been used for over 60 years on over 1 million wells around the world. That's a fact. But as I started out saying, we're not just talking about fracking. We're talking about an entirely new form of use of that technology within the framework of an entirely new process. Unconventional development of natural gas from shale formations. So why is unconventional development using this new kind of fracking so different than the 1 million wells that have already been fracked, so that we can say that that experience of fracking those 1 million wells is largely irrelevant? That's the question I'm going to try to answer for you. So-called conventional gas development or conventional oil development has been using fracking for over 60 years, but it's fracking on a scale about 1/100th the scale of what's being proposed for shale gas development. So I'll try to describe what I mean in a couple of ways. In a conventional gas well, of which there are probably 1 million in the United States, the amount of fracking fluid that was used during the fracturing process was on the order of 100,000 gallons, 400,000 liters. A typical modern shale gas well, an unconventional shale gas well, uses about 100 times as much fracking fluid, on the order of 20 million liters. That also means that the amount of waste that's produced, because much of that fracking fluid comes back up to the surface, and when it comes back up to the surface, it has in it not only some of the chemicals that we used when it was injected into the earth, but it comes back up with other materials that have been previously stored safely underground for the last 300 million years out of the human environment, and now it's into the human environment. So you have roughly 100 times more fluid being used, water and chemicals, to go down to do the frac job, and 100 times more waste coming back up. So to me, it's uninformative to say fracking's been done for 60 years, 1 million times. What are you worried about? This is a different kind of fracking. It requires much more equipment operation on the surface because you're injecting much more fluid at very high pressure. So the equipment on the surface has to be much more powerful. Thousands of horsepower, diesel engines running for days at a time. And the waste stream is much higher volume. And when the waste stream comes back up, it brings with it a lot of methane, natural gas. And we'll talk about that when I get to myth number 4. Okay. So I just described myth number 1, which is that fracking has been done for 60 years on over 1 million wells. Why should we worry about it? The answer is quite simply, we're not talking about the same kind of fracking. The fracking is so different that in various locales around the world, there are currently a moratorium or ban. In my home state of New York, we've been studying this new process for 4 years. And we're not near finishing the study. We don't have an environmental impact statement. We don't have new regulations to control this new process. But our state leaders recognized that it was so radically different that we had to start from scratch in studying it. Let me proceed to myth number 2. Myth number 2 is that wells that leak are rare. So I'll explain what I mean by that. Here's the surface of the Earth. Here's a shale formation. I have to start that again. Here's the surface of the Earth. Here's the shale formation, some thousands of meters below the surface of the Earth. To get the gas out of the shale, one has to drill many wells, and those wells have both a vertical component and a lateral component. And typically on a pad, which is an area at the surface where the drilling and the fracking occurs, there are many wells that are drilled. Every one of these wells has punched a hole in a medium, the rock, that has formed a seal between the surface of the Earth and where the gas is and where other harmful materials have been stored in the shale. Salts, heavy metals, naturally occurring radioactive material is in the shale along with the gas. Every time we poke a hole in this seal, we have the potential for a leak. That leak is outside the well when it occurs, and it can do two things. It can either allow hydrocarbons to leak into the atmosphere, and that's bad because hydrocarbons are greenhouse gases, and along the way, this leaking hydrocarbons can come into contact with underground sources of drinking water. So the shale may be 1,000 or 2,000 meters below the surface, but the underground sources which private individuals will tap for their drinking water can be contaminated by a leaking well. Now the myth is that it's rare. This occurrence is rare. Wells rarely leak. Rare is in the eye of the beholder. So the industry says that only a few percentage of the wells that are drilled leak. That's true. Now, what's the fable part of this myth? If you're going to drill in an area 100,000 wells, for example, in New York State, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, we're over the Marcellus Shale Formation. The industry claims it's going to drill over 200,000 wells in that area. If there's 5% of the wells, small percentage that leak, only 5% leak initially, that is, right when they're first drilled, that's 10,000 wells that are going to leak. So be careful about comparing percentages to actual numbers. That's part of the myth. People tend to think 5% failure rate, that's pretty good. I mean, it's a very complex process. Give the industry some credit. Only 5% of the wells leak initially. But what they don't tell you is, yeah, but we're going to drill 200,000 wells in your region. That means there's going to be 10,000 leaking wells. What's the economic, environmental, and human health impact of 10,000 leaking wells? It's not inconsequential. The other thing they don't tell you about the myth is they extract the time element from it. What the industry will say is only about 5% of the wells leak. What they fail to tell you is 5% of the wells leak immediately. The wells are supposed to last forever. Once you poke the hole in this protective barrier of rock and put layers of steel and cement into the well to form the structure of the well, if any element of that well fails over time, if the casing corrodes, the casing cracks, the cement cracks, shrinks, or corrodes due to a variety of sources, then you have lost wellbore integrity. The well can no longer transport only gas to the surface. It now becomes a conduit for other hydrocarbons or other materials to make their way from deep underground into an underground source of drinking water or into the atmosphere. So to repeat, the second myth is only a small percentage of the wells fail. That's true. But even multiplying a small percentage times a large number of wells can lead to a large number of failures. Second part of the myth is that over time, the wells fail at a higher rate. So perhaps something like 5% initially. But what they fail to tell you is something like 50% over the life of the well. The responsibility for protecting underground sources of drinking water in the atmosphere from contamination from hydrocarbons or other materials does not end when the company says, the well is no longer economically productive for us. We're going to shut it down. Because it's still there. It's still a potential leak path. Someone has to continually maintain that well, basically forever. Otherwise, we get to a point where most of the wells are going to be leaking, and that makes the problem even larger because now you have hundreds of thousands of new shale gas wells in the region, a large percentage of which are leaking. Not today, but leaking on our children and our grandchildren, generations to come. And so you have to ask the companies that are going to be producing the gas now, making the profit for their shareholders now, are you going to maintain the environmental and human health responsibility for the life of the well to repair and maintain it so that leakage is minimized?
Is it possible to estimate the cleanup cost when a well leaks? I mean, is this something that a company would budget for, or?
So it's, with respect to the second myth about a very small percentage of the wells leaking, a logical question to ask is, what is the cost of a leaking well? Another logical question is, well, if a well is leaking, can it be repaired so it stops leaking? Or if it has leaked and it's contaminated an underground source of drinking water, can that underground source of drinking water be remediated? Can it be repaired? Those are three really important questions, each of which has a scientific essence to it. Science has to be done to answer the question, and they each have an economic consequence. So let's address each in reverse order. If an underground source of drinking water, an aquifer, near the surface has been contaminated with hydrocarbons or drilling mud or material that was previously safely stored in the shale, if it's been contaminated, can it be remediated? In theory, yes. In practicality, very, very difficult because it depends upon how much of the aquifer has been contaminated over what period of time and at what concentration from the contaminants, and are the contaminants still entering that groundwater? So it doesn't do any good to try to remediate if you don't kill the source of the contamination. The remediation can take years and can take very large sums of money. At the very worst case, you can't remediate, in which case every private landowner who was drawing drinking water from that aquifer now has to have that drinking water restored from another source. Typically what happens in the US when this happens, and it happens way too frequently, they can't fix the groundwater source. And so families living up here who used to draw their water from a water well in their backyard now have to be trucked water to their home. Every few days, a truck drives up, gives them a few thousand gallons of fresh water in a tank in the front yard, and from then on, you don't turn on your faucet anymore. You carry buckets.
And who pays for that?
Well, it depends upon the locale. In some states, the law says that the injured party, in which case it would be the family that's lost the access to their drinking water well, they have to be compensated forever. In other states, it's incumbent upon the families who have lost their drinking water to prove, literally prove in a court of law, that their loss of drinking water was caused by a leaking well. There are no uniform federal regulations in the United States that cover this. It's done state by state, and different states have different rules. let's go back to the question of, well, if the well is found to be leaking, why don't they just fix it? Well, they can try. A process called squeezing attempts to repair the cement bond, the cement seal that is trying to assure that the well is not leaking. Squeezing is an expensive proposition. The well has to be taken out of production. Another contractor with squeezing specialty has to be brought on site. The squeezing process is very, very difficult to do, and it's not guaranteed to work. So it costs money to repair a well. So if a company is found to have a leaking well and they're issued a violation, if the cost of paying the fine is less than, significantly less the cost of repairing the well.
And is that often the case?
This is often the case. So I'm aware of cases in Pennsylvania where a repair by squeezing has been attempted 3, 4, 5 times on one well because the well has been highly productive, it's producing a lot of gas, but it's also leaking. A company will pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to try to repair a well that's going to produce millions of dollars of gas. And the squeezing doesn't work. So now we have a problem that is literally irreparable. So the best the company can do now is plug the well. They can come down inside the casing of the well, the steel pipe through which the gas is supposed to be transported to the surface, and insert a cement plug, which takes the well out of production forever. The well is lost to production. But plugging a well does not fix an external leak. So now the company can walk away and say, well's out of production, we're not making any money off of it anymore, it's still leaking, we tried to repair it, too bad.
Well.
Go to myth 3.
Sure.
Let me give myself some whiteboard space. Myth 3, what I refer to as myth 3, is the use of clustered multi-well pads reduces the surface impact of the development of natural gas from shale formations. So I want to tease that myth apart by first telling you the factual kernel of it, and then again telling you why it's been embellished to become more fable than fact. So take a situation like Bulgaria, or New York State, where I live, which has never had shale gas development using unconventional means, multi-well clustered pads, high-volume hydraulic fracturing from long laterals. So we're faced with a choice. Currently we have no surface impact. And the industry is saying, if we come to town and use this particular kind of development, you'll have less surface impact. Well, that's illogical. The least surface impact you can have is what you already have. None. So to say you can have less surface impact than none doesn't make any sense. What the companies are trying to get you to understand is that if we didn't use this modern technique of multi-well pads clustered, we would probably use conventional techniques, in which case we'd have more pads. But that's also illogical because you can't develop economically shale gas using conventional techniques. So on one hand we have an illogical comparison, on the other hand we have an uneconomic proposition. So they're asking us to believe that things are going to be better because they're going to get worse. So let me explain what I mean by multi-well clustered pads. This is a bird's eye view. Here is a large area of Bulgaria or New York State. The way modern shale gas development works is the following. I'm drawing pads. This is bird's eye view. I can draw this over hundreds of square kilometers, as far as the shale extends. I'll just stick with 4 right now. Clustered pads means that the pads are arranged in a grid pattern, not necessarily perfectly uniform. It depends upon geology, depends upon leasing, depends upon available capital, depends upon competition between companies. If you only have one company, and that company is only dealing with one landowner, the government, they could reach an agreement where the company would do what I call the ideal arrangement. You put a pad everywhere you can, and from each pad, you drill multiple wells. In this case, I'm only drawing 6 from each pad. But there can be many more than 6. So what I've just shown you is an example of what's called clustered pad arrangement, multiple wells from one pad. The reason for this is you've now got as much coverage of the laterals. These red lines represent the lateral portion of each well. You've got as much coverage as you possibly can because the gas is virtually everywhere in the shale. So again, this is a major difference between conventional gas development and unconventional gas development. In conventional gas development, you would drill one well from this pad and hope to hit a pocket of gas underneath it. Here, the gas is distributed throughout the shale formation, so you want to distribute your wells throughout the shale formation. So now let's return to the myth. Clustered multi-well pads reduce surface impact. Well, you've got roughly 1 kilometer between those two, and roughly 2 or 3 kilometers between these two. So if you're living anywhere in here, you are part of this industrial operation. If your home happens to be here, or here, or here, or here, you are either immediately adjacent to a pad, or the drilling is occurring under your home. This is called spatially intense development of shale gas wells. It's the way it works. That's the most economical way of extracting all the resource. Think of the shale formation as your warehouse. And you have a private enterprise where you're trying to sell product out of your warehouse. If the product doesn't leave the warehouse, you don't sell it. You don't leave any of the product in the warehouse. You pattern the surface so that you get as much as you can. So what? What's the impact? The impact is each of these pads, I'm using acres here, is 5 to 10 acres. It means clearing forest land, removing trees, or removing farmland from production. It means on each of these pads over a period of years, because it takes years to develop all these wells, there's going to be heavy equipment operation. Heavy equipment operation means air pollution from burning diesel. It means light pollution because these operations go on 24/7. It means noise pollution because this is a very noisy operation. It means dust pollution because in general you're in the countryside and every one of these pads is going to need access roads. Every one of these pads is going to need a pipeline because the gas goes to market through pipelines, not through trucks. And all of that construction destroys countryside. It doesn't reduce impact, it creates impact. There is a fourth myth that I want to talk about, and it's the one that I have the most concern about, because it's a myth that affects everybody, not just the people in Bulgaria and the people in New York State, but we all live in the Earth's atmosphere. And we are experiencing global warming. We are experiencing climate change. The best scientists on the face of the earth studying this problem all agree that that climate change, that global warming is being exacerbated, accelerated by the use of fossil fuels. Natural gas is a fossil fuel. It's one of 3 siblings: coal, oil, natural gas. They are non-renewable, they are fossil fuels. The myth is natural gas is a clean fossil fuel. So first I'm going to tell you what's true about that statement. At the heart of every myth is a kernel of truth. And then I'll tell you how it's been embellished so that it becomes more fable than fact. It is true that when you take an energy equivalent mass of coal, oil, and natural gas and burn them, because they're fossil fuels, to get something out of them you have to burn them. If you take an energy equivalent amount of coal, natural gas, and oil, the amount of carbon dioxide that's produced by that burning is much less for natural gas than it is for coal or oil. That's true, scientifically incontrovertible. Now, if that was the only part of the problem we had to worry about to determine whether these fossil fuels were clean or not, we'd be done. So the two things I want to address here. What do we mean by the word clean, first of all? And then, is there something else we have to take into account other than the carbon dioxide that's produced when we use these fuels? So let's look at the second question first. To get carbon dioxide out of a fuel by burning it, you first have to find the fuel, you have to produce the fuel, you have to clean the fuel, you have to transport the fuel, you have to store the fuel, and then you burn it. That's the life cycle. So in the production of each of these fossil fuels, not only do we have to worry about the carbon dioxide footprint that we get when you burn it at the end, we have to also worry about other greenhouse gases that are produced while the fuel is coming out of the ground and being stored, transported, processed. Whether you're drilling for natural gas using conventional means or unconventional means, shale or not shale, there is a substantial amount of methane, natural gas, CH4, that's either purposefully emitted or accidentally emitted across that entire life cycle. Let me explain what I mean. When one drills a well and fracks the well, the fluid that's injected for fracking comes back up to the surface. Much of it does. When it comes back up, it's also transporting methane. So the well doesn't immediately go into production. You don't connect the pipeline to the gas well as soon as you frack it. You have to wait for the frack fluid to come back so that the well clears, and then you can connect it to a pipeline and put it into production.
Okay.
While that flow back of fracturing fluid is occurring, there's a large volume of methane that's also contained in it. That was the whole purpose of fracking, get the methane to come back up the well. That methane is either vented directly into the atmosphere for a period of days, or it's flared, that is burned in a flare. Both of those are bad. If you're burning it in a flare, you're producing carbon dioxide. You're literally burning the methane right there at the well site. But that's not nearly as bad as venting it, because it turns out that methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. That's a key point that the industry doesn't want you to know. A small amount of methane is equivalent to a large amount of carbon dioxide with respect to global warming potential. Molecule per molecule, CO2, CH4, carbon dioxide, methane, the methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas. So even a small amount of leakage, whether it's purposeful or accidental, can have a very large impact on global warming. So, to answer the question, the heart of the myth, is natural gas a clean fossil fuel? You have to answer the question, well, over the life cycle of each of these fossil fuels, what is the total impact on greenhouse gas production? Not just carbon dioxide by burning it, but methane by producing it, processing it, storing it, compressing it, transporting it in pipelines. So we've done studies on that question at Cornell, and there are other studies that have been done in the last year and a half, instigated by our first study. And we're now beginning to understand that a significant percentage, 2 or 3%, doesn't sound significant, does it? 2 or 3% of all the methane, natural gas that comes out of a natural gas well, leaks, either purposely or accidentally during this entire life cycle. So why is 2 or 3% significant? Because methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Over a 20-year period, methane is 100 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So a 2 or 3% leakage rate essentially is doubling the effect of just burning the natural gas. So you're, pardon the pun, you're burning your candle at both ends. It's double jeopardy. Not only are you harming the atmosphere in terms of global warming by burning the fuel, you're harming it equally well, or equally badly, I should say, by producing the fuel.
May I ask why the methane wouldn't be captured as opposed to vented or flared?
Okay, a question that's typically asked is, why would a company do something as stupid as throwing away their product at the wellhead? Why don't they just capture all the methane, reduce all the leakage, eliminate all the leakage? So let's talk about those two questions first. Why not capture all the methane that's coming up the well while it's being drilled, while it's being fracked? So while it's being drilled frequently on the way down to the formation of shale that you're trying to produce from, there are other layers of shale that also have gas. While the drilling is going on, it is technically impossible to capture that gas. You can't connect a pipeline to a drill string.
Okay.
So that gas gets vented.
Okay.
Now, the well has been drilled, it's been cemented, it's been cased, it's now fracked. As the fracked fluid comes back up, it's coming up at large pressure and at high volume. And it contains not only the frack fluid, but methane and whatever else was down there. Why can't the company immediately separate the methane during flowback and send it to market? Technically, they can. Two things are required. First is what's called a reduced emission completion unit, REC, a REC unit, also called a green completions unit, for obvious reasons. That unit is specially designed to handle the high flow rate and the high pressure of frac fluid return and is capable of separating the methane and other gases from the liquid. Companies should be required by law to use green completions. They are not even in the US. Not until 2015. Our EPA issued new regulations just this year requiring companies starting in 2015 on all new wells, conventional, unconventional, oil, gas, to use green completions. There is not enough green completion equipment in the United States currently.
Is that the reason for the time lag?
That's the reason for the time lag. So the industry petitioned the EPA and said, okay, we'll conform to the new regulations, but we can't do it. Not until 2015. It'll take us 3 years to produce enough of those units for us to follow the new law. But that's only one of two requirements. You can have a reduced emission completion unit, but if you don't have a pipeline in place, you got no place to put the gas. So now let's talk about pipelines in place. That's capital intensive investment. Not only do you have to drill the well, frack the well, but you have to have already spent the money to build the pipeline to each well pad. If you don't have a pipeline in place, there's no place to put the gas. So it doesn't make any sense to have a green completion. So the green completion units cost money. The pipelines cost money. If you start developing before you have all the infrastructure in place, you are doomed to either flare or vent. Both of those are bad for greenhouse gas emissions.
Are the green completion units expensive to produce?
The green completion units are relatively expensive, on the order of $100,000. That sounds like a lot, but a typical shale gas well, even in the United States right now, where the price of gas is drastically reduced compared to what it is in Europe and Asia, companies fully expect to produce millions of dollars of gas from a shale gas well. So the imposition by law of a requirement that they use a reduced emission completion unit, which can be used again and again and again, so it's amortized. It's not you're going to spend $100,000 in a well, you're going to spend $100,000 in that unit and use it many, many times.
Right.
So the cost per well is relatively low. But until a law came into existence, a rule in the US that companies were required to do that, they didn't. Even though it would have brought them increased revenue to capture all the gas.
Isn't that illogical?
It's illogical until you ask the question, at what rate of return on investment are you going to expend money on something like a green completion? If your return on that investment, whether it's $10,000 or $100,000, is only a 5 or 10%, okay, and you can use your capital on something that can return an investment of 10, 20, 30%, ask the shareholders what they want you to do. So a question that's frequently asked is, given all the potential problems with unconventional development of shale gas using clustered multi-well pads and high-volume hydraulic fracturing from long lateral portions of the wells, can this ever be done safely? So let me try to answer that question first from the point of view of what engineers talk about when they talk about risk. Engineers don't like to use the word safe. Worse is the word safer. If something is safe, it can't be safer. And nothing is ever safe because safe implies no risk. A more logical way that all the industries, including the oil and gas industry, assess safety is through risk analysis. And that requires a quantification of the probabilities of things going wrong. So this is quantification of risk. You assess all the possible means by which something can fail and cause some sort of harm. You assign a value to each of those probabilities, and then you make a go, no-go decision. You do a cost evaluation. So let's use that idea of quantification of risk and a cost-benefit analysis to shale gas development. In my opinion, given all the possibilities of things that can go wrong, have gone wrong, and will continue to go wrong, with the entire life cycle process of shale gas development, processing, storage, transportation, and end use, that cost-benefit analysis at this point is negative. It will cost society more than what I think society can benefit from. The bookend proofs of this, in my opinion, are the following. The very, very local effect of drilling hundreds of thousands of wells in a relatively small region to economically develop shale gas will inevitably cause very substantial impact on local landowners. That impact can be loss of their private water wells, loss of the value of their properties, loss of their quality of life because of all of the local pollution, air, noise, light, water pollution that inevitably accompany this sort of spatially intense industrialization of the landscape. Those are unavoidable. The industry is proud to say that in the United States they've already drilled and put into production 20,000 shale gas wells. Then why are we still having all these problems? Why are some states, like my own state, saying, wait a minute, we don't know enough yet? This is an experiment in action, except the experiment isn't happening in a laboratory. It's happening in real life in people's backyards. So the industry can't say it's safe and at the same time then agree that more study needs to be done. If the more study needs to be done, the study should have been done before they started the experiment. Okay. The other bookend, this one was local. Individual families are going to be impacted. The other one is every family is going to be impacted. There is no way around natural gas being a fossil fuel. No amount of research, no amount of new technology is going to convert natural gas to being a non-fossil fuel and to being renewable. You burn it once, it's gone. But when you burn it, you're producing carbon dioxide just like coal, just like oil. So to the extent that people, their governments, and their regulators are concerned about climate change and its impact on human health and the environment, and the cost of that impact, then you cannot also take into account that that climate change impact is being exacerbated by the increased production of shale gas. We are all downwind. We're all downstream, everybody in the face of the earth. If shale gas is produced from New York State, we're harming people in Bulgaria. If shale gas is produced in Bulgaria, you're harming me. Not only me, but my children and my grandchildren. Are you willing to take that responsibility? Are you sure that the short-term, immediate financial benefits that accrue mostly to the shareholders of a company outweigh the costs of healthcare, groundwater remediation, loss of property, loss of contentment in your own home? Are you sure that that analysis has been done and it's shown to be one way or the other? That analysis should have been done before we started. Bulgaria hasn't started. My home state of New York State hasn't started. We have an opportunity, because the experiment is going on in a few other places, to do scientific study, technical, scientific, environmental, scientific, industrial scientific, economic scientific, and health scientific. Those are the studies that need to be ongoing right now so that we can make an informed decision of that cost-benefit ratio. But my opinion right now, based on what I know, and my multi-decade experience working with the industry and doing research recently on the climate change issue and the local concerns issue, is that this is a losing proposition. It's certainly a losing proposition for our generation, even more so for our children's and grandchildren's generation. That natural gas that's in the ground might be useful sometime in the future. It's not at all useful right now. There's plenty of natural gas on the market. The more we burn now, the less there's going to be for future generations. The more we burn now, the scantier the supply will be in the next generation. As supply goes down and as population goes up, prices go up. Which is why I try to conclude my talking about this issue not with a negative, but with a positive. The negative is no to shale gas. The positive is yes to other things. And the other things are the obvious ones, the renewable green energies, whose supply is infinite and its cost is only controlled by nature, not by boards of directors of private companies. No one will ever tell you that the sun costs more. No one will ever tell you the wind costs more. No one will ever tell you that falling water costs more. No one will ever tell you that the movement of waves to generate electricity will cost more. Those are all fundamentally natural, controlled energy production processes. They're renewable, they're green. They don't carry any of the risks that I talked about with respect to shale gas development. That's the positive message. For a small country like Bulgaria, or even for a relatively small state like New York, we have options. We can choose to say no to shale gas while at the same time saying, let's take that private investment and that government investment and that effort on the part of the people and put it to work so that our future generations aren't saddled with the same fear that we have right now, that there may not be a healthful climate for future generations.